Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Mulholland and Jeff Shuck. We are so grateful to be tuning into this conversation today, welcoming you to Plenty for Everyone. I'm calling in from Park City, Utah at our retreat center called Heart Space, and Jeff is in his Michigan City, Indiana office. And we're grateful to be able to introduce to you a wonderful new guest, Carolyn Swora, who we had the privilege of meeting from our publicist, Smith Publicity, who connected us about the launch of our book, Leading with Light, Choosing Conscious Leadership When You're Ready for More. And Carolyn graciously had us on her podcast, the Evolve podcast, and we had the most delightful connection and wonderful conversation. And we felt like we needed to extend that and have her
Yeah,
on our show. So, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about who our audience is going to be hearing from today?
I would love to. And thanks again, Jen, and welcome to everyone. So, a little bit about Carolyn before we share the conversation with you. Carolyn's a mom of two, scholar, author, podcaster, and former corporate leader who thinks with her heart. We love her already. We want to read a little bit of her story to you, and you'll hear her on the episode talk a little bit about this or at least parts of it in some more detail. She says, like so many leaders, I used to think that the best way to lead was by using your head. That was until I realized that unresolved trauma significantly impacted how along with many others, performed at work. And so I decided to leave my corporate job and have since embarked on a rewarding journey of rediscovering myself while helping leaders like me make space for empathy and courage in their high performing roles. So she's one of us. She has gone on to get certifications in a number of interesting disciplines, and she's going to talk about one, the Enneagram, in a lot of detail. And she's doing really cool things that we start to explore in this podcast.
Yeah, and what I loved most, well, there was a lot of incredible moments during our conversation, but I really appreciated how she started off by talking about the definition of trauma and
Mm,
welcoming listeners into a more expansive understanding and view of what that could be in the spirit of wounds and emotional wounds. And that really, I don't know, it felt like more accessible and less labely,
yeah,
if you will. And it
yeah,
really opened the doorway to hearing more about her personal journey of loss and grief and parenting and all the roles she plays and the pursuit of perfectionism that she will talk about that I so related to and just felt like a kindred spirit across the borders. She's calling from Toronto, Canada, so not in the United States, but really felt like she's a fellow, traveler of a path of conscious leadership and working on herself and having these beautiful moments of epiphanies of gentleness and compassion that she talks about in her journey to be the best person she can be.
yeah. It was just a great conversation. And in some ways, it's kind of the second half of a conversation, like you said, Jen, that we started on her podcast. So if you're interested in what you hear, we'd invite you to look up her podcast, which again is called the Evolve Podcast. And the episode from us was probably about 4 weeks ago, which right now would mean it's late May 2024. And so look for April 2024 and find us and part of the story. But I've no doubt that we'll be talking with her more and hopefully working with her. And she's doing some, like I said, really cool and interesting things. And I love what you said, like a kindred spirit. And you don't get to see this if you're listening, but she even wore a shirt that says Shine Your Light that she said she picked out after she met us. So great conversation. We're happy to bring it to you and we hope you enjoy it.
Yes. Tune in. You'll learn a lot about hopefully yourself in the process and also how important our nervous system is and how it plays a role in how we show up and work in life. So enjoy the next conversation, and we look forward to hearing what you think. Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Mulholland with Plenty Consulting calling in from Heart Space in beautiful Park City with my co-leader, Jeff Shuck. Would you like to say hi?
Hey, everyone. It is great to talk with you. And as you just heard, we're joined by a special guest, Carolyn Swora, who, if you're a listener of Plenty for Everyone, you may know that we were featured on Carolyn's podcast about a month ago. And we're so taken with the conversation that we had to have her on our podcast. Carolyn, we're so glad that you're here.
Thank you. And it was a really powerful conversation. It was one of my most listened to episodes actually in the first 7 days.
Lovely. Well, you have such a beautiful podcast, the Evolve podcast, and couldn't be more grateful for our publicists who have introduced us. I think that has
Mhm.
been one of the most beautiful, surprising escorts to people like you as we launched our book and you hosted us talking about leading with light. But as Jeff mentioned, just the feeling of the conversation left us wanting
Mm,
more. And
nice.
I think that's the intention for today is exploring what feels alive and present and introducing you to our community and really getting into the depths of exploration around, what does feel alive and conscious and bubbling to the
Mm,
surface in the realm of leadership. You have and speak so much about trauma-informed leadership, and I'm not sure if people even understand what that is, and
mm,
if that's something that you even want to explore. So, would just tee that up for our listeners that Carolyn has published several books and really, putting out into the world new perspectives around trauma-informed care as it relates to leading ourselves and others in the
yeah.
workplace and in the career.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to go there. Before we do though, I just want to share with you all that I got this shirt last week
Oh,
and I
Nice.
lovely.
bought it. And I thought, oh, it totally is going to be perfect for when I come on the show with Jeff and Jennifer. And so, if I sort of segue from the Shine Your Light shirt, I think that's what writing my second book, Evolve: The Path to Trauma Informed Leadership, it allowed me to find this little light in me that had never really gone out, but it definitely had flickered and gotten smaller. And writing Evolve really came from a very different place than my first book. And it came from my heart. Evolve really was written from my heart. It started out as a kind of a memoir. It was going to be called The Perfect Widow. Who wants to be a widow? Unfortunately, I was. And who wants to be a perfect widow at that? Well, I did. And so that's probably why my light was so small, because, achieving perfection is going to be a fruitless journey. So, the book evolved into what it is now, which is a book about leadership, really through my own journey. And through that, I feel like I have been able to really find my own light. Like, if I come back to one of the things that we talked about together was the lantern. I don't know if you used the word lantern, but you talked about the
Yes.
power of holding this light and how it emits, you know, um, a circumference that you can see. And I think as I was writing Evolve, I just kept believing that it was going to lead me somewhere. I didn't quite know where, but what was unfolding in that circumference of light around me felt conscious, it felt more aware, and it felt like something that needed to be shared.
Mm.
Carolyn, do you mind backing us up a little bit and talking about the trauma that's in the book and that maybe as much as you're comfortable with, kind of what spurred on that evolution? And
Yeah.
we'd love to learn a little bit more about your husband and just
Yeah.
all of
Happy
that.
to. So let me start off. So I know sometimes the T word, the trauma word, can be like, whoa, I don't want to like press stop. I don't want to listen to this. Um, so I want to invite all your listeners in to maybe recalibrate what that word means.
Mhm.
And it at times has been perceived to be an event, a disastrous event, or maybe something really horrible that's happened to somebody. So quite often we've associated that word with an event. And what I'm going to invite people to do is to lean on the research of Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, Dan Siegel, all of these tremendous researchers who have taught us that, and Bessel van der Kolk, obviously, they've taught us that trauma is so much more than that. And one of the simplest descriptions of this word I like to use, it's from Gabor Mate, and it's a very simplified version. And he calls it an emotional wound. And I really love that description because when I read that in his book, The Myth of Normal, I thought, oh, okay, I can accept that I've had emotional wounding in my life. It's harder for me to accept that I'd had trauma in my life. So,
Mm.
as we go through this conversation, I'll share a little bit about my story. Just think of the emotional wounds that you might have had, because we've all had them. It seems a little bit more of an easier entry point. Um, I had a fairly big event. Again, if we associated the T word, trauma word with event, I had an event in my 30s that was sad, unfortunate, not what we had expected. As a newlywed, we were expecting our first baby, and my husband at the time was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer. So I was 6 months pregnant with our first child. And I knew enough that that was not a good prognosis and happened to work in an industry that I could access information about that disease. And so it didn't look hopeful. But that being said, I still held out hope. I still wanted to believe for the best. And, Paul got some excellent care. We went to the States for it. I'm in Canada, by the way, so that was a bit of a journey. And he lived for 6 years. We had two babies in that time, and we lost him in 2009. The boys were 4 and 5 at the time. And so that shifted. That was obviously that was an event, but as you can imagine, all the emotional wounds that came along with that. So that was sort of a definitive point in my life that clearly changed how I was viewing the world. At the time, I was in a corporate, like in the corporate world, I was in big pharma, and I got a tremendous amount of support. So grateful for that. Financially, we had great coverage. Also emotionally and from a work perspective, for the 6 years that he was ill, I never missed a day of work. I had such trust from the leaders that I worked with. Um, so it was wonderful in that way. It also kind of shifted how I viewed the world, obviously. And that kind of put me, after experiencing that loss, really put me on a path of healing that I wouldn't have called it that at the time. But definitely there were things that sort of just seemed a little bit more important. And so as I grew from that loss, I entered into another relationship, and so got remarried, and the boys got older. And there was some more learning that needed to be done. My lamp, my lamp had more to teach me, my light. And I went on this deep journey of self-awareness. The system that I chose to expand my awareness around my self-awareness was through the Enneagram world. So the Chestnut Pius Enneagram Academy. And that really opened up a whole other layer of awareness for me that helped me unpack some things that had happened earlier in my life. So what I've come to realize is that, in fact, my entire life has been built around a lot of emotional wounding. And that was a bit of an eye opener for me when I looked at that and then looked at my ambitious dreams and found a very strong connection between the two, which sort of put me into this space of trauma-informed leadership.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So appreciate you sharing the context and a little tiny bit of your journey. We know there's so much more
Mm,
to share. That I love the definition that you use around trauma as you started to kind of set the context for your experience, because I am a culprit of like the big T is a turnoff, right? And
Yeah.
then just the buzzwords and like how all of a sudden we societal kind of gloms on to
Yep.
labels, and then we have a certain definition, and either you buy that definition or you don't, or then you identify with it or you don't. And it's interesting when you think of some of these emotional woundings or emotion, energy in motion, that we have
Mhm.
things moving through us. We have different experiences in childhood as the child, but also as we become parents,
Yes.
if that is in your kind of journey, there's a different energy moving, emotions moving,
Absolutely.
right? And oftentimes, I think that you speak about the wounding is personal, right? It's
Mhm.
happening to you, with you, and your relationship to it. And then we like discount or don't even understand that there's wounding or there's messaging, there's pressures, there's experiences that are coming from society, culture,
Yep.
those norms. And so, how did you like navigate both? It sounds like the personal experience of
Yep.
loss, of needing to be mother, and your identity of mothering with yourself without
Yep.
your partner any longer. And then that like evolvement of identifying, the how the healing or the self-awareness exploration, how did that help you
Yeah.
put the salve on the wounds? Because I think so many people are searching for that, right? What is the solve to the wounding? What is the antidote to the trauma? How
Yeah.
can I fix these open wounds that I'm
Wounds.
carrying forward? And for everyone, that's different, but how did you find peace and centeredness in your path?
Oh, it's such a great question. What I learned at the very beginning of my path using the Enneagram was this notion of three centers of intelligence. That we have a head center, a heart center, and ding, 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 this was news for me, we have a body center. And so that was one of the first steps for me to recognize the disconnection between my mind and my body. And that pathway for people to find that connection, that reconnection, is really, really important. And there's various ways. For me, it came through studying the Enneagram, but I know there's lots of different ways. And I think societally, that was a big eye opener for me. And it's a continual path, because I have spent a good portion of my life out of my body and in my head, because that felt safer for me for a variety of reasons. And that's essentially what happens with this emotional wounding, with trauma, is we store these memories get stored in our body. It's an amazing coping mechanism to deal, like when you mentally can't deal with some of these things, it gets stored in your body. Those emotions get stuck. So that was the first thing. That the solve to this was step one was recognizing that disconnect, and it was massive, massive. I now had some understanding about why movement was hard for me. I mean, I was an athlete growing up, played high level competitive sports, almost became like a coach at an Olympic level. And so understanding that I was carrying all of these emotions in my body, and it was really hard for me to find movement. So that was a big piece to this. The other thing I would say was recognizing that I am part of a system. We are all part of systems. And those systems can be a family system, could be a community, could be a workplace. And what I hadn't ever really thought of was my role within the system. And I didn't realize I had choices within the system. And so I'm gonna talk about that specifically around work, because I came into the workplace eager, ambitious. I had goals to go global. I wanted to be a VP. I didn't, interesting, this could be another topic of conversation. I didn't have any desire to be a president or a GM, but definitely wanted to be an AVP, or whatever that sort of next level was, and really ambitious. And the way that I'd grown up, an only child raised by my mom, and I was pretty athletic. So I spent my youth being able to beat the boys at pretty much any sport that I could, until physically they got bigger, but I could still, hold my own. So I took that mindset into the workplace. I'm like, well, whatever boys can do, girls can do better. Right. That's kind of, remember that from the 80s, right? There's probably like a little ditty
Yep.
that's going through my head about that. And so I just worked harder, and I thought that the path to success was doing exactly what the boys do. And I know it's very gendered, so I'm speaking very much from an 80s, 90s mindset. But whatever they can do, I can do better. So through my career, I had 12 different roles. In the 17 years I was in big pharma, and 2 of those promotions came while Paul was sick. So think of this: caring for your essentially like dying loved one over 6 years, raising 2 children, and I started a business in the last 2 years of his life, and I still didn't feel like I was doing enough. I didn't realize that I didn't have to play by the rules of that game in that system. I didn't realize that I had choices, didn't stop to ask questions. I just was so focused on beating other people. And that was a big part of this journey, is realizing, Carolyn, you do have choices. You are in a system, and you can challenge the status quo in a way that aligns with who you are authentically.
Mm. Oh my gosh, there's so many threads there to explore. A lot of your story parallels, I think, Jen's story, not to speak for you, Jen, but a story that Jen shares in our
Yes.
book. Um, Maybe one thing that I would like to, there's lots of places we can go, but one place specifically you just took us by backing up a little bit is, at Plenty we talk about 90% of this this is about awareness, about just being mindful of your thoughts, seeing them for what they are, being mindful of the control mechanisms of others and the ones that we put on ourselves, the expectations that we have that aren't even real, the system and what we think of it and what power
Yep.
we give to it, like all of that, just seeing it. And once you can get to that place, like everything changes. So tell us that bridge. What happened between the striving, proving, beating, I'm better than everyone at this, and the like, oh, let me try Enneagram. Was
Right.
there one catalyst
Oh,
of the
yeah.
awareness, or
Yep.
can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that?
I'd say there were 2 catalysts. One was my own burnout. So I went on we'll call it a burnout leave, reluctantly, 2 years before Paul passed away. So in 2007. And I only did it because my former boss, bless her, took me out for lunch and said everyone around me was worried about me. And I'm like, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. And everything wasn't. But she kind of gave me permission to look after myself. So I went as part of the short-term disability program. I had to go see a therapist of some sort. So I went very reluctantly, and I did a stress inventory, and his name was Scott. And Scott said, so what do you think? You completed all of this. And I think my score was like in the high 300s. And I think highly stressed was like 150 and above. And he said, what do you think about this? And I still remember it to this day. I looked at him, I said, well, it's too bad for everybody else. Like, I'm just stronger than they are. So that was a really interesting experience with him, and recognizing that. And during that burnout leave, I just thought it was for me to get sleep, a little bit of extra sleep, because it'd been a hard 4 years. I now look back and realize the seed started to get planted for my own perception of the voice that talked to me in my head, my own expectations of others. But I was back to work like 6 months after that. And I really needed to go into a different gear because Paul was going to be nearing the end of his life at that point. So I kind of went back to some old ways. So what really, really set me on a path of, Carolyn, there's something that is happening and it belongs to you, was when my boys were in their teenage years. And one of the things that the child psychologist had told me when they were younger, like 6 and 7, is that the boys are going to process their dad's death through every stage of development that they go through. So as they entered into their teen years, processing his loss, it was like it just had happened. And there was something that was very not connecting by the way I was showing up in this. And that was my motivator, is there's something that I'm not doing, that I'm not seeing them, I am not connecting to them. And that's always been a big strength of mine, is to be able to connect with others. So that was the impetus, was I need to own my own stuff. I need to understand what I am contributing to this that's making it feel not comfortable. And I'm not saying not painful. I know that processing this can be painful, but there was something that just felt disconnected. And great suffering, I'm a big believer in, from great suffering, you can take that and you can do something with it. And so that's where I went with it.
Yeah, and then it's wrapped in that perfection, the
Exactly.
holding. I'm chuckling and smiling so big because there's no accident that our paths have crossed. It's like a
Yeah.
soul sister across. In fact, in 2007 was the year I had to take a
Really?
leave too, and I had the most amazing boss. But I had a miscarriage at the time, and my
Mm.
body was speaking to me. I was having a hard time sleeping, and turns out I had an active parasite in my body.
Oh.
Um, and so it was I call it the escort to
Mm.
diving deeper into my own awareness of what was working and what wasn't, and what did I really want to be? What was I here for?
Right.
And I had I just had an amazing job. I loved what I did. And I could just feel the call that there was something I was meant to do that that had no constraints. And that just led me onto this path of a lot of self-discovery and
Mm-hmm.
healing training and energy work, and going to retreats and saying, I want to do that.
Yep.
That was the invitation. But, I think what's so interesting to relate, that I know both Jeff and I can relate to, but is this, like, the constant pull to be better,
Yep. Yeah.
the you know the conflict of, I am enough right now. Like, what if I really bought that? So if I'm fully enough, then what is the better? Does better have any position in that statement, right? Because they're kind of at odds.
Right.
Of enough, to me, feels like acceptance of really resting in the here and the now of what is. And yet there is this unconscious and conscious drive to want to be a better human being, to do more, to have a better impact, to be the highest performing human being I can possibly be. And then it kind of gets wrapped up in, is that a perfectionistic, viewpoint, that I'm holding myself to having these standards that is only hurting me
Mm.
inside? And I hear that in you, of like this the pattern of the disconnect, because when we're in that place of performance as an
Yep.
athlete, and I'm an athlete now, and always have been.
Yeah.
It trains you in the best of ways for the business world. Like, I'm so
Yep.
thankful I've been an athlete. There's new research that, all the CEOs who are women, 97% of them were athletes.
Wow.
It just teaches you drive, resilience,
Yep.
leadership, teamwork, strategy, training, all that stuff. And it kind of can sound like it's like the hard path, right? Like there's a destination and you're moving towards something. So really having to take those positive qualities and then unlearn and be gentle and softer and accepting the enoughness that what if I don't have to change? What if I could really be with here and now? So maybe you could speak to that. Do you still find the tension point between this driver, this woman who wants to achieve and to be more, and the acceptance, loving, healing part of you that
Yeah.
it is feeling like it is enough right now?
So I would say I definitely feel in a place of more acceptance and more compassion, like to the point where it's astounding to me how much I've lived without that for as long as I have, and kind of sad as well, to be honest. That's a pretty fascinating quote. I want to circle back or stat that you shared that 97% of women CEOs have had experience in sport. And here's a really an insight for me. I lost my connection to sport because my body was so disconnected from my head. And I had lived most of my life unconsciously treating my body as an ornament and not an instrument.
Yeah.
So one of my previous guests on my podcast, Lori Sulpizio, I think I pronounced her name right. She's a professor in San Diego. I can't remember, San Diego State University. And she used that comment with me and it's never left me. And so in sport, I think I can comment on my experience and maybe you can tell me if yours is the same or not, Jen. But I learned how to use my body to achieve something.
Yeah.
And that's the piece that we don't talk about when it comes to leadership. We don't talk about our intuition. We don't talk about the signals or the cues of our body. We don't talk about how our nervous system gives us an abundance of information. Sport allows us to do that without talking about it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's a piece for me that has brought me into self-compassion and self-acceptance, because now that gap between my head and my body, which was there because all sorts of stored trauma, I now can communicate and accept my body for what it is and not try and make it look a certain way or be a certain way. But I can use it to help me be a better leader. And really, it's allowed me to develop so much more self-compassion for myself and to appreciate what I have instead of, which I did cognitively, but I never did from a somatic perspective. And so for me, it's the integration of and the acceptance of my emotions as being a big part of who I am. It's accepting, well, the cognitive part, right? The smarter you are, and hey, I love school. So that part was never difficult for me. And then accepting my body and being thankful and grateful for all that I have with it, not what I was missing. So that piece to me, I think, is particularly resonant with me as a woman, an ambitious woman, and recognizing that I will be accepting and compassion and shine my light. And the word ambition, that doesn't really need to play into it at all anymore for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what you speak to, I think it relates to man or woman, is certainly something, a principle we practice
Hmm.
and talk a lot about in Leading with Light and with Lantern, is
Yes.
is just noticing the disconnection. Like, are you aware of your breath?
Yeah.
Are you aware of your arms when you're in speaking with somebody? Do they cross? Do you lean in or do you lean out?
Yeah.
And are you listening to those cues? Those are something that it's so applicable in business, in as you're making decisions, as you're hiring people,
Hmm.
as you're managing up, as you're setting strategy, is to listen to, do you feel pain in your body? Do
Hmm.
you have a headache?
Yeah.
Are you tired? Are you enlivened by the conversation?
Right.
Does time slip by that you're so in the present that you've been caught up by the creativity and the muse and the essence that's coming into form? Those are all wonderful signs.
They are.
Not to say that the other signs are not wonderful, but they're clues to pay attention as you are leading yourself and others
Yep.
in the workplace and in life, that it is such a practice, whether you're male or female. And it's wonderful that we can actually start talking about this in the business sector, because
Yes.
for a long time, it just wasn't okay to do so. It just
Yep.
felt woo woo. It wasn't where people wanted to spend time. But if it can be one of your, greatest tools to unlock performance and growth with your team, why wouldn't we start to infuse the workplace and culture in this conversation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's been, that exactly has been why I've continued to pursue my own learning around what is going on in our body. And so I've become a huge advocate, admirer, insert other words there, of polyvagal theory and the whole science of safety. And, when we talk so much in our workplaces about psychological safety, the next part of that conversation we need to be having is, you can't have psychological safety without physiological safety, without understanding what's going on physiologically inside of you. And the science behind this has given me a lot of, I guess, confidence and belief and understanding about why I did what I did, why I performed the way I performed. And it's just given me a lot more understanding and consciousness about the different parts of me.
Hmm. I have two things I want to say and then explore with you. One is the just the role of, not to get too far into this rabbit hole, but the role of the idea that someone has to win
Mm,
basically means that someone else has to lose, right? And we're kind of seeing the logical result of that kind of thinking in our
yep.
society. And I don't know if it's because of sport. I did look up, as we're talking, 95% of male CEOs in the Fortune 500 also played college level sports. So there's something
Mm,
about not
yep.
gender necessarily, but that competitive environment. And there's such a great thing about athletics and being your best, but there's also a side of it that's like, I have to win,
Yep.
right? And the positionality, like literally understanding the positions of others on the field and defending your position and all of that. And I think in our work with teams, positionality is often what we're trying to work beyond, right? We're trying to get to common alignment instead of understanding or reinforcing everyone's unique positions. So
Right.
do we have to, I guess the question in here is, when you do your work with leaders and your coaching work, is there a transcendence? What I want to explore is that idea for me to feel good about myself, right? When you got to that point of like, I'm ready to accept myself, does that naturally help you become more accepting of others? Did you find, like,
Yep.
how did it work? Did you find that you became more compassionate with yourself and so you became more compassionate with others? Or as you became more compassionate with others, you decided to become more compassionate with yourself? Do you see what
So
I'm?
it's a, yeah, I do. And there was a little bit of both. And I'm going to tie some polyvagal theory in here if that's okay. Um, I'd always felt like I'd had compassion for others. And I did up until a point, until there was a certain undeclared threshold. And that threshold usually had to do, so when I would lose compassion or I would get competitive, was when I perceived somebody to be better or in a place where I wanted to be. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where the compassion, that switch would flip off. And so, you know, the more that I grew, and I've always been one to want to learn about myself, but it wasn't until I started to embrace the shadow side that I was able to get clear of that. I'll just call it, for lack of a better word right now, that compassion switch. As I started to uncover and release some of the stored emotion, I realized how uncompassionate, is that a word? Uncompassionate? How unkind I've been to myself, and how this constant need to push through has
Mm-hmm.
permeated all I do. You know, like I never wanted anybody to have pity for me. I told one of my best friends when Paul was sick, and I'll never forget that conversation. And I saw a tear come down of her eye when I told her his diagnosis. And imagine you're a 6 month carrying, being 6 months pregnant, and having to tell a friend that, or being on the receiving end of that. And I looked at her and I said, "There's nothing to cry about. Stop crying."
Oh.
I just wouldn't allow any emotion in at all. There was so much like, no one's going to have pity for me. I'm strong. I'll look after it. So as I gained more compassion for me, and it's a process, like I'm still learning to do that, I have more capacity to have compassion for everybody around me. I don't have that threshold anymore of like, oh, they have something I don't have. So that's sort of dissipated. So that sort of answers the first part of your question. If I bring it back to polyvagal theory for a second, I'm just going to make it really super simple. We have sort of three core states that our nervous system will oscillate between. And to keep it really simple, one's a green state where we're in play, we're in flow, we're connected to others. And when we're in that state, so for those who like the science of it, we call it ventral vagal state. Um, our social engagement system, our ability to be compassionate, our ability to be open, our ability to be in flow, like all of those things are activated, and they're activated because we feel safe. We don't feel a sense of threat or perceived threat. Now, there's another state that is called sympathetic state, so fight or flight. And that state, when we're in that state, it helps us. It can help us navigate through threats. And sometimes these threats are just ways of getting our attention and allow us to focus a little bit more. So if we look at sport, you know, NBA finals are going on right now. One of those, you know, those teams that are playing, they need to have that activation. They need to have a little bit of threat, not just fully relaxed in that play zone or in that sort of full safe zone. That is the sweet spot of performance. The challenge is we get stuck in that sympathetic drive, which then can pull us more closely to a full shutdown, which we would call dorsal vagal. And then we get stuck in this loop between dorsal vagal shutdown and sympathetic, which is fight or flight. And then we can't break out of that. So if I were to sort of link that back to what you said, Jeff, the my ability to be more compassionate to myself and others deepened as I was able to pull out mindfully of consistent of spending too much time in that sympathetic state.
Yeah, I love how you just frame that, and so relatable, and
Mm,
love that study, that method of studying and understanding, especially our nervous system and how that relates to our
right.
performance. I find that if I'm not careful, that second state, the performance state, the pressure state, the competitive state, I'm so competitive with myself
Right.
there's a certain standard I have to play the roles that I play. And the compassion is such a practice of unlearning and then relearning a new way of being in relationship with myself, where that really questioning what is the environment, am I needed to be in that pressured state right
Exactly.
now?
Yeah.
So there's two thoughts. One is vacations for me have
Mm,
and time off or space that is unscheduled, unplanned is a way that I intentionally force myself to kick out of the competitive space
yes.
of the driver accomplishing, producing, performing. Because honestly, that's my natural state. Even if I go home, I'm like organizing, I'm cooking, I'm
Yep.
directing, I'm making decisions, I'm doing a gazillion things. I'm still in that
Yep.
performing, high performing state. When I go on vacation, it's almost like I'm forcing myself in a new environment to have no schedule, no roles, no agenda.
Yep.
And it takes like 4 days to get into that pattern, right? But it definitely starts to unlock. Um, and then, and so I'm just inviting listeners to try if you identify with this kind of performing state, how does it work for you to shift into the green state, right? The
Yeah.
playful mode, the flow state. Nature is a wonderful tool, creating more space in your day,
Yeah.
having unscheduled time, learning what works for you so you can kind of unplug from being the high performer. Not all the time, but I love what with choice,
That's
um,
exactly it.
of when
It's
you want it on and when you want it off.
right. And so this is so I said there were three states. Each of those three states will blend with each other. And so
Right.
what you're talking about there, Jen, is learning how to resource your system to give it cues of safety so that it can unhook from the threat or the stress. And good, like we can have good stress that gives us the performance, but learning how to mindfully acknowledge, like, yep, I'm staying up to do that presentation again, or I'm cooking a 5-course meal instead of just, having some good old pasta. Like having a mindful choice and then giving your nervous system cues of safety or resourcing it. So, like you said, going for a walk. Somebody said to me recently, she's like, I hate walking every day, but I've been doing it for the past 20 years. And I force myself to go out there every day. And every day, I do not regret my choice. And those are the types of choices. And because she's like, when I'm out there, the awe of nature and being in it, but she's like, every day I have to tell myself to do this. And I think this notion for leaders of one, knowing your state and mindful, you're going to oscillate through all three states. So it's not about, oh, I always need to be in the green state or ventral vagal. It's just knowing where you're at. And is this the best place for me to be given what's happening right now? And if it's not, how do I resource myself? And also, am I trying to do too much and recognizing I'm in dorsal vagal, or I call that one the red or the yellow zone, and trying to do stuff that I need to be in the green zone for. So
Well,
yeah.
can I add? I think it's also being wary of your metrics. Like pick your
Say more.
metrics wisely. You know, we you now can measure everything. You can measure everything that's happening in your body with your watch. You can wear it on your wrist. Your iPhone captures tons of things that you didn't know about until you got your iPhone. We work with teams and ask to see their strategic planning or their strategic metrics, and there's
Mm,
50 metrics on the balanced scorecard, and we're going to be great at all of them. And like that's a lot of pressure to be great at everything. And usually teams and leaders that have companies that want to be great at everything extend that to their home, and they're great at collecting wine, and they're great at cooking, and they're great at working out, and they're great at keeping the home. And at a certain point, you can't be great at everything, and you'll be exhausted if you try to be great at everything. And there's just, I think, like being intentional about what's really important and trying to bring awareness to like, why am I trying to do I really need to be the fastest jogger in my neighborhood? Right?
Yep.
Right now I'm playing golf a lot with my son. He's way better than me. I'm still learning. I'm terrible. So right off the bat, I usually play better with him because I have no pressure because I go into it
Mhm.
knowing he's going to be better than me. So that's very interesting. And then he gets frustrated if I play well because he's thinking I'm better than dad. I've also noticed when we have a scorecard out, he plays markedly worse if we're
Mm.
keeping score. And
Yep.
when we just say like, let's just say it's practice, right? He'll get pars and birdies.
Right.
And it's dangerous for a man of my age to use a golf metaphor. So I'm going to stop right there because it's so trite. But I think the people we work with, I think myself, I think you, Jen, we are measuring ourselves on so many things that we don't realize. And then not only are we measuring ourselves on things we don't consciously realize, we're expecting ourselves to be the best at them.
Yeah.
Like, what's my VO max? Like all the shit nobody knew 30 years ago. And now, like, literally, your phone tells you that you're falling behind. So I think just being intentional about like this is what's really important to me now, and sometimes sleep is what's important to me,
Uh,
sometimes not looking at my phone is what's important to me, sometimes curling up in the sun is what's important to me, and all of those things have value whether your phone or your strategic plan says they do or not. So I would just
yeah.
wanted to tag in
Yeah.
that piece of
Yeah.
it.
Love
All
that.
those things resource us in a way that we need to be resourced in the moment. And I love what you said too, be careful what you measure. I'll just share with you, there are two things that I measure kind of every day. And these are part of like what I think makes a good leader. And one is, how well was I in connection with people? Was I present? Was I with them? Was I not? And there's days where I'm not, like, so it's not like, oh, was how perfect was I? But how connected was I to my environment, to all of that? Um, and the second one is, how reactive was I today? Did I give space? Did I overreact on something? Was I able to have a conversation about a hot topic and be in the moment? And so those are two things that have really guided me over the past few years. And I'm not always going to be in connection with somebody. I'm not always going to be really zen and responsive. And so it just becomes more data for me to just continue to get to know myself and allow myself to just continue to expand my awareness. We all know, right? It's not a destination, it's a journey. So those are the two measures. Just when you said that, I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
I love that. And it's really empowering to think of we get to choose what we're measuring. We get to choose
Yes.
what we're focusing on. And as so many people have heard us say before, whatever we're focusing on, we're forming. So we're bringing more attention and energy to that which we choose. And so if we're needing to practice more compassion or presence with ourselves and others, just simply bringing that into the field, we'll get more experiences seeing when we are really doing well at that, and equally balanced when we suck at it, because it's just the nature of awareness. We start to see the light and the dark,
Yeah.
and we can't have the light without the dark. You mentioned something earlier that I've always said to myself, and it's something I've tried to shed, but when I look at the gift in the shadow, which is the gem of shadow work, if
Mhm.
anybody has done shadow work. I studied a lot with Debbie Ford. She was the queen of looking at the gifts of the shadow, that the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we want to disown and we want to say, I am not that, really birth and give energy and life form to the things that we want to be. And when we find ourselves in that competitive space that you were talking about, that is sneaky. All of a sudden it shifts from
Mhm.
compassion to competitiveness. And it's like, well, it is such a teacher for me to show, oh, I want that. That's what it's telling me. It's like when I
Yep.
have envy of something else, it's for me, it's the universe saying, get on it.
Mm,
And so I get to choose whether I want to bring that into the field to
right.
focus on so that I'm not envious of it anymore and of any envious of it anymore. And I literally bring that forth. It's a complete energy driver to say, oh, I'm not doing that right now, and I want to be doing that. I mean, it is
Mm,
such an interesting compass for me. And on the shadow side of that, it's like, oh, I have to have more to be more. I have to
right.
be someplace else that I'm not. So reconciling that, whatever you choose to focus on, is the beauty about being human and the beauty about evolving into our highest expression of growth. We get to choose that person we want to
Yep.
cultivate and work on and love. And oftentimes it is so much easier to love your best friend or love your spouse or love your child than it is to give those nature giving, unconscious ways of care to ourselves. And I think
Mm.
that's
So
ultimately
beautifully
where the
said.
practice is.
Yeah.
Well, we could be talking for hours.
We
I
could.
love the rabbit holes and so grateful that our paths have crossed, Carolyn. Can you tell our audience where can they find you? What would you like to leave them with today?
Yeah, well, if anyone ever comes up to Toronto in Canada, give me a holler. I'll take you to a Blue Jay game. A Raptors game would be my first choice. Um, but no, in all seriousness, you can find me at carolynswora.com. And, information about my podcast is there. My 2 books are there. And some new projects that I'm working on to really help integrate polyvagal theory into leadership so that it becomes sort
Mm,
of part of this conversation around psychological safety, and that we start to understand our own states and how to resource our nervous system so that we can understand cues of safety, not just cues of threat. So all of it would be there. And you can find me on LinkedIn and Instagram. Those are the 2 main platforms I'm on. Oh, and YouTube. I've got some stuff going on YouTube too.
excellent.
Yeah.
We'll put links to all of it in the show notes. Thank you so much for your help in shining our light. For those of
Mm.
you, by the way, who are listening and didn't see the shirt that Carolyn
Yes.
is wearing at the
Shine your
beginning,
light.
it
Yeah.
says "Shine Your
Shine your
Light,"
light.
which we love.
Yeah.
And thanks for letting us shine and doing the same with us. It's been lovely to meet you, and let's keep the conversation going. There's more to talk about, I
There
think, here.
is. And an IRL and in real life, I think needs to happen. We'll make
Yeah,
that
Yes,
happen.
it'd be
I'm
so
moving to
great.
Michigan. I'm going to be that much
There
closer
you
to you.
go. There
Yeah,
you go. Well, and thank you, Jen and Jeff, for all your work and this connection and what you do for your clients. It's
oh,
really making a difference.
Thank you.
lovely.
You
Thank you.
too. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for tuning in. Join the conversation and learn more at plentyconsulting.com.